Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching A+ Essentials Personal Computers Part 1. This is part of Train Signal Fast Track CBT video, CompTIA A+. In this video, our overall goal is just to help you understand the fundamentals of personal computers. We'll talk about topics like what is a PC, what makes up a PC. We'll learn about storage devices, system boards, hard drives, cases, power supplies, CDs, DVDs, floppy drives, tapes, all sorts of components that make up the personal computer. Alright, first let's talk about the specific A+ exam objective that we're covering in this video. We'll be covering exam objective 1.1. Now that says that you should be able to identify the fundamental principles of using personal computers. That includes floppy disk drives, hard disk drives, CDs, DVDs, rewritable drives, recordable storage, USB drives, USB connectors, external CD-ROM drives, thumb drives, flash drives, form factors of motherboards and cases, components that go into a computer like sound cards, video cards, modems, memory slots, processor slots, bus architecture, bus slots, IDE or serial SATA drives, SCSI technology, chipsets, BIOS, riser cards, daughter boards, and you should be able to identify the names, purposes, and characteristics of power supplies. Wow, that's a lot. We have a lot of exciting topics to learn in this video, and we'll be covering again Objective 1.1 of the A+ Essentials exam. So first off, let me start with a little quiz. Which one of these is a PC? Well, you've got option A, the laptop. This is the laptop right here. You've seen a laptop before. A portable computer set on your lap, carry around with you, has its own built-in battery. Is that a personal computer? Well, let's move on before we answer. Option B, the box, I call it. Here's this big box right here. Some people call it the CPU, some people call it the PC, some people call it my system, different names for it. But basically this is the box that sits under your desk and everything connects to. Then there's option C, which is over here. This is the monitor, flat screen LCD monitor. Is that a PC? Option D, I just called it the whole thing. So here you have a Mac. Is that Mac a PC, by the way? You've got a printer, you've got a keyboard, mouse, there's even an iPod there. Is that a PC? And my point of this little quiz is PC is such a generic term. So many people use it differently. You can't go around correcting people's use of the word PC or their improper use of calling a PC something else. Unless you're the manager and that person works for you. But when it comes to supporting end users and helping them with their PCs, they may or may not call the right thing a PC. Now, to answer your question, technically all three of these right across here, you could call PCs, personal computers. You could call the laptop a personal computer. It is a form of personal computer. It happens to be a portable computer with a built-in battery and a built-in monitor. But yeah, it is a personal computer. Most people, though, call it a laptop or a notebook. They differentiate it in that way. This box, I called it the box, is definitely a personal computer. That's the original, sort of definition of what a personal computer. This exemplifies what a personal computer is. It's the box, and I'm going to show you everything that's inside that box. Down here, the Mac. Is the Mac a personal computer? A lot of people would jump up and be in arms about, oh no, a Mac is not a personal computer. Well, technically it is a form of personal computer. It is a computer, and the new Macs even have Intel chips and can even run Windows. So it's hard to say anymore that a Mac isn't a form of personal computer. Now, is a Mac the same thing as a Dell or HP personal computer? No. It's made by a different company, but they're all forms of personal computers. Now, the only really wrong answer in this is this one down here, the monitor. The monitor is not a personal computer. Now there are some monitors that in the back of them, they actually have a full personal computer kind of hung on the back or built in the back. I've even seen keyboards that have personal computers built into them. But technically, that's the only wrong answer in this little quiz, is the monitor is not a personal computer. All right, so what is a personal computer? Let's talk more about that. We'll spend this whole video talking about personal computers. But what really is a personal computer? Many people think they know what a PC is, but there's so many misunderstandings of the term. A personal computer, or PC, is a system of components that work together just like the human body. A PC is computer hardware, not the operating system or the applications. And there's a lot of components that make up a personal computer, just like my comparison of a personal computer to the human body. The human body has a heart, a brain, lungs, kidneys, all these different things that are required to make the body work. And without many of those components, there's very few redundant components in the human body. So without any one of those, typically the body is in trouble. Same thing with the PC. There's so many components that make up a PC. And I've listed out some of those components down here. The motherboard, the processor, or the CPU, the memory, the storage, the power supply, video card, input devices, adapter card, ports, cables, and the cooling of the PC, typically the fan. So all these things make up the PC. And let me point out that PCs are modular, meaning modules can be taken in and out. Pieces of what make up a PC can commonly be replaced with other pieces. Now what that means is, say I buy this box over here, this one right here. I buy this Dell PC, and later I want to replace the RAM, or maybe the RAM goes bad. I can open up the PC and I can replace it. Same thing with the hard drive. The hard drive goes bad, or I want a bigger hard drive, I can open up the case and replace it. When I say modular, that's what I'm talking about. It's a modular computer. Now, some computers aren't that modular. Pieces of them cannot be replaced, or there's only one or two pieces that can be replaced. An example might be a laptop. It's not very modular. You can replace the RAM, but that may be about it. There's not many really upgrades you can do, or modules that can be easily swapped out on a laptop. All right, so we talked about what is a PC. Let's look a little bit more at a diagram of a PC to help us understand all the parts that make up this personal computer. So here we have a diagram, and you see this tan square down here. This is the box, and the box is a technical term. That's a joke. An untechnical term for the case, right? This is the computer case. And inside that case, though, are all the components that make up the PC. So we've shown some of the components that make up this PC here by kind of showing you what they look like if they were pulled out of the computer case a little bit. So the motherboard in this case goes on the back side over here. So you can see we kind of slid the motherboard out. And up here on the motherboard are some different components that make up the personal computer. There's the CPU, or the microprocessor, right here. There's the main memory, or the RAM. It's these chips here. And then there's expansion cards that stick out of the slots on the side of the motherboard. So that motherboard slides in and screws in inside this case. Then there's the power supply. This is the power supply here. Slides in and goes in right there. This is what converts the AC power from your electrical outlet. It plugs into the electrical outlet out the back here into DC power and powers all the components inside the motherboard, or inside the computer, I should say. Then here we have the optical disk drive. This is the CD-ROM or DVD drive. We've slid out and it would slide back in right there. Then there's the hard disk drive, or the HDD, typically called the hard drive. It's right here. We're going to go into more detail on hard drives, but it slides right back in the computer there. So you get the idea of how all these different components go in this case, and how all these different components typically are modular, meaning the power supply goes out. Well, I just replace the power supply, or I upgrade the power supply with a more powerful power supply. So that's how a modular computer works. That's how the components go inside the case. Then you have some other pieces that are required really to make up or to make a PC usable. Really, all this over here, this is the personal computer. But without a monitor, you're not going to be able to see what's going on with the personal computer. So although the monitor technically is not a component of the personal computer, it's a separate component called a monitor that hooks up to the personal computer. Still, it's a required piece for you to be able to see what's going on. Now, sometimes there's servers and data centers that don't have monitors on them. They hook them up. They hook up a monitor once. They configure the server. They disconnect the monitor, and then the server just keeps on running. So that's why I say it's not always required, but 99% of the time it is. Then there's the keyboard and the mouse, and those are shown right here. So these are your input devices. These are peripherals, they call them, or add-ons sort of that hook up to the personal computer over here. So technically they're not required, but 99% of the time you got to have a keyboard and a mouse to interact with the PC. So those are the different components of the PC. And again, this is a generalization because there's a lot more that makes up this entire computer system. There's the cables, there's the power supply. Inside the case, there's other components. There's the cables that connect the keyboard and mouse back to the computer. There's a lot more to it than this. But this is our general working diagram for a personal computer system. All right, now we have some more common PC questions and answers just to make sure you're still paying attention and to make sure you're learning something. So, is an Apple Mac a PC? Well, that was one that we already answered, but it's an important question because for many years there's been this feud between Apple computers and PCs. Technically, an Apple computer is a PC. It's a form of personal computer. Now, usually when people are talking about Apple versus PC, they really mean Apple versus Microsoft or Apple versus Windows. Today, Apple computers actually have Intel processors, the same processors that computers that run Windows run. And you can even boot up a Apple computer with Windows, or you can run Windows inside the Apple Macintosh operating system. So these two have come much closer together than they ever were in the past. But technically an Apple is a PC. So if somebody says, oh, I don't want an Apple, I want a PC, what they're really talking about is they don't want the Apple Macintosh operating system. They want the Windows operating system that commonly runs on personal computers like Dell or HP systems. All right, second one is, why do people think they have to choose between an Apple and a Mac? Well, I just answered that. This feud that's been going on for so long is why people have this mindset that they have to choose between them. Really what they're choosing between, though, is the operating systems between the two. The Apple operating system won't run on Dell or HP systems or other Intel computers. It'll only run on Apple computers, which are now Intel. The Windows operating system, however, will run on Apple systems as well as personal computers from Dell and HP. So where did the term PC come from? Well, let's look at a little bit of history here. I'm going to click on this web link. And this is a IBM Archive website, and it talks a little bit about the history of the personal computer. So here it says the IBM PC's debut, and here you see a picture of the IBM personal computer back in 1981. Now, IBM launched the IBM 5150, and it was introduced some 25 years ago, back in 1981. Here you had a large company, IBM, and they were typically making these huge computers that took up, a whole room. Rolling out this PC was a big change for them, and it wasn't long after that that the IBM PC really changed it all. The price tag you see here was about $1,600 for the original IBM PC. That was pretty much the bottom of the line model. And over time, this IBM PC, evolved into the computer market, and the standards of personal computers that we know today. So that's the IBM, the original IBM PC, and I think it's important, to have some idea of what it looked like and what it could do and when it first came about. All right, next question is a laptop a PC? Well, we answered that one a couple slides back. Yes, a laptop is a form of PC, but typically people call it a laptop or a notebook. So up here is a Apple notebook or laptop, if you want to call it that. But from looking at it from here, it's hard to tell that. But I can tell it because I know that that's the picture that I took of an Apple laptop. So why is it important to know what's inside a PC? Well, if you're going to work on PCs and troubleshoot PCs and understand PCs, you need to know what's inside of them. Just like if you're going to work on a car or be familiar with cars, you're going to have to understand how that car works. You're going to have to know how to take it apart and put it back together and understand all the components. All right, last question. What about a server? Is a server a PC? Well, over here on the right, you see a rack full of servers, all these Dell servers in this rack. So are these servers PCs? Well, they have PC architecture. They're relatives of the original IBM PC, but basically people call them servers. Just like the laptop, they call that a laptop. They don't really call it a PC. People call servers servers. Now, they're very similar to personal computers. They have processors, RAM, hard drive, power supplies, BIOS, all those things, but they just have a much more robust architecture. They're more powerful, and they have a lot of components that common PCs don't have. All right, so now let's talk about storage devices. Storage devices are an important part of personal computers. When computer data is not being used by the CPU, that's the processor in the computer, it must be stored on a storage device. So you can think of this storage device as a place to store your data. So perhaps the data will stay in the computer, perhaps it will be transported when the computer's off. Think of this storage device as your file cabinet. So you have your desk, you're looking at your desk in your office, you have a bunch of documents on your desk. If they're on your desk, that means you're probably working on them at that time. At least that should be the case. You don't want a bunch of documents piled up that just you're not working on at all, right? If you're not working on it, where do you need to put it? You need to put it away in your filing cabinet. That's where you put things that you're not working on at this time. When you're ready to work on them again, you go to the file cabinet and you bring them back to your desk. Well, RAM and storage devices work the same way. So think of the filing cabinet as your storage device. So when you're not using your data, it goes into your storage device or your hard drive. Now, when you do use your data, it's brought into RAM. And we're going to talk more about storage devices and RAM in just a minute. But try to think about that concept and keep that in mind as we talk about these. The storage device is your filing cabinet for when you're not using data. When you need to use it, you pull it out of the filing cabinet or off the storage device, up into RAM or onto your desk so you can work with it right at that time. So let's talk about some different types of storage devices. All right, the first one is the floppy disk drive. The floppy disk drive, some people call it the FDD, they abbreviate it that way, started off as a large 8-inch floppy drive, a huge floppy disk. Today, floppy drives have gotten down to 3.5-inch disks. Right here, you can see this. This is a 3.5-inch floppy drive. And the shell of the 3.5-inch disk is more rigid than the old floppy drive used to be. But still, you shouldn't call it a hard drive because that's something completely different. Now, today, floppy disks aren't as popular as they used to be. In fact, many new computers aren't coming with floppy drives at all. But these flexible plastic disks have a small flexible plastic disc inside that holds magnetic material on it. People also call them floppies or diskettes. Now typically these hold 1.4 megabytes total across both sides of the disk. So that's 720 on each side. The disk drive has to access each side of this disk. Discs have a spring-loaded cover to cover the media, but it's open when it's inserted into the drive. So this little cover right here moves back on a spring when the disk is inserted into the floppy drive here. Now, discs also have a write protect tab that can be used to prevent writing to the disk. The write protect tab is right here on the corner, that little square. On the back of the disk, you can flip the tab with your finger to prevent people from writing to the disk. So there's the disk right here in the center. Here's the front of a floppy drive. You see how the disk slides in the front. There's a read and write light right there, and then there's an eject button. This is the back of the floppy drive. On the back of the floppy drive, you have a floppy drive interface here where it connects to the computer. Then you have a floppy drive power supply connector up here. All right, so that's a floppy drive. All right, now let's talk about USB flash drives. Now, really, before the floppy drive, there were many predecessors to the floppy. Today, in reality, the 3.5-inch floppy has been generally replaced by the USB memory key. So this USB memory key is also called a USB flash drive or a USB thumb drive, or just a thumb drive is what many people call it. Now today, you can get over 1 gigabyte on a small stick about the size of your thumb. And unlike magnetic media, USB memory keys are rarely affected by dirt, nor do they deteriorate with use. So this USB memory key actually is my memory key, and I had it in my pocket and it went through the washer and the dryer, and after that my 1 gig memory key still worked fine, and it still works to this day. So interesting story, but it shows you just how rigid and reliable these USB memory keys are. I mean, you could not do that with a floppy disk at all. Floppy disks, they get some dirt on them, they get dust on them, they get dirty, and they don't work anymore, and you've lost your data. Plus, you're talking about 1.4 megabytes on a floppy drive. Well, here you can get over 1,000 megabytes on this little tiny memory stick that you can put on your keychain. So amazing technology, and in fact, these flash disks, which are inside here, are now being used on newer laptop systems as the primary disk drive, or the only disk drive. They call it solid-state storage. All right, now let's talk about hard disk drives. So we talked about USB flash and floppy drives, and those are really meant to be portable storage that you can take with you. Hard disk drives, on the other hand, are meant to be more permanent storage that either you install into your computer or you connect to the back of the computer, but they're meant to be plugged in and powered on whenever the computer is powered on. So a hard disk drive is also called an HD, or a hard drive. Or sometimes it's called a fixed disk. Now, a hard drive is a form of magnetic media. Now, unlike a floppy disk, a hard drive is sealed, and it's made up of a number of platters that are stacked together. Hard drives today can be over 400 gigabytes and can be found not only in PCs and laptops, but high-end printers, copiers, TiVos, digital video recorders, camcorders, and iPods. So you can find hard drives in all sorts of devices. They can store a huge amount of data today, and these magnetic platters are spinning at very high speeds inside that case, sometimes as much as 10,000 RPMs per second. Now, hard drive systems are made up of a disk controller. So this disk controller is inside the computer, sometimes built onto the motherboard, sometimes it's a separate card. Then you have the hard drive. Then you have the host adapter. Now, typically the hard disk and the controller appear as one, and the host adapter appears to be part of the integrated motherboard. Types of disk controllers and host adapters are SATA, eIDE, and SCSI, and we're going to talk more about these. Now, for external storage, there's also USB and FireWire, and even SATA portable drives. These are drives that are self-contained in a little box. They have their own power supply. They plug into your computer via one of these technologies, USB, FireWire, or SATA. They plug into the power, and you have an instant, 500 gigabytes or whatever the size of that drive is. You can disconnect it, carry it with you, and plug it into another computer. So they're portable, but they're much larger, not something you could carry around in your pocket like a flash drive. All right, so let's take a look at what's inside a hard drive. Here we have a diagram of a hard drive, and here's the platters, the magnetic platters that I was talking about. And this diagram only shows two, but in reality, in real hard drives today, there's could be many more. Now going in between and on top and on the bottom of the platters are these arms. See, it says arm for head 1. These arms are moving back and forth across the platter at very high speeds, and then the platter is spinning at a very high speed as well. So here's the main spindle that all these platters are on. There's multiple heads. These heads are what are reading the magnetic platter. So think of those heads kind of like the old record player. But these aren't analog devices like the old record player was. And then all this is on a chassis, and then that chassis is covered with a cover, and it's sealed in a special manufacturing plant that has very highly filtered air, so that there's not a chance of dust or dirt or anything like that getting inside this hard drive. That's the reason you can't take the cover off the hard drive. Just the tiniest particle of dust could ruin the whole hard drive. So that's what the internals of a hard drive look like. And these hard drives can be very tiny, and they can go in laptops or iPods. They can be much larger and hold a lot more data. They come in different form factors. They can be hot swappable, where you can pull them in and out of a computer. They can be put in external cases, so you can sort of carry them with you or move them around a little bit more than an internal hard drive that's screwed and mounted inside a computer. All right, so there's various kinds of hard drives, like I said. Over here, this is a laptop hard drive. Although it looks the same size as this one down here, it's actually just the picture. This is only 2 inches wide. It's a very small laptop hard drive. You can see here it connects at the bottom. This is the same hard drive upside down. You can see it connects at the bottom, and it has a tiny power supply connector. This is an example over here of an external USB drive that also has FireWire. So inside this case is a hard drive like this one down here, mounted with its own power supply, and then a USB interface or a FireWire interface. Down here, this is a typical internal hard drive that you would mount inside your computer. Notice on the back here, it's got an interface connector, and then it's got a Molex power connector over here. We'll talk more about those power connectors. This is a hard drive that's mounted in a hot swappable case, and it's in a hot swappable case in case, say, it fails in a server, and you want to swap out that hard drive without ever shutting down the server. Now you have to have special hardware in the server to allow you to not lose your data and to be able to hot swap that hard drive. Just take out the bad one and replace it with a new one without ever shutting down the server. But just goes to show you that you can take this hard drive and you can mount it in a hot swap case, you can mount it in an external case, you can mount it inside the PC directly, or it could be very tiny and it could be inside a laptop or an iPod. So all these different ways of using hard drives are available. All right, now let's talk about CD and DVD storage devices. Another type of storage device is an optical drive. So it uses light to read disks. You'll find today that most new computers have CD and DVD drives. These drives can read both CDs and DVDs. Now, much of the time, these drives can also record CDs and DVDs or create those CDs and DVDs. Many people call that burning a CD or a DVD, although it really doesn't use heat necessarily to do it. But what really is a CD or a DVD? Now, we think of CDs as being used to listen to music and DVDs being used to watch movies. However, both of these types of discs can be used to store data. CDs and DVDs are optical discs, and unlike magnetic media, once they're created, optical discs will last virtually forever unless the disc is scratched or damaged. So optical discs have a very long life, and they're very reliable if they're properly taken care of. Now keep in mind that there's many formats of CDs and DVDs. So let's look at some. The first one is a CD-ROM. A CD-ROM is read-only memory, and the CD-ROM stores about 650 megabytes of data. If that's what you choose to put on there, is just raw data. So what happens is the CD is burned, and then after that, that's it. Whatever data is on there cannot be taken off or changed. Then there's the CDR. CD recordables is what a CDR is, and these drives are sometimes called CD burners. So this is a drive and a media that you can take and you can create your own CD. Then there's CDRW, or CD rewritable. So what this means is you can create a CD. Later you can come back and you can add some more data to it, or you could delete everything that's on it and reuse it. So it's a reusable CD. Then there's DVDs. DVDs store 4.3 gigabytes of data, so they hold much more than a typical CD-ROM that holds only 750. So you can see why DVDs are getting more and more popular because they hold so much more data. And that's a single-sided disc. You can also get a CD or a DVD DL, which is a double-layer disc, and it stores 8.6 gigabytes of data, 4.3 gigs on each layer. Next one is DVD plus R, DVD plus RW, DVD minus R, and DVD minus RW. These are different formats of recordable, that's the R, or rewritable, that's the RW. So rewritable, again, can be used multiple times. Just the R can only be burned once. And the plus and the minus have different pros and cons. You need to make sure that your drive can read the type of disc that you buy, the DVD plus or the DVD minus. Then there's Blu-ray disc and HD DVDs. Both of these are new, and they're used to store just a ton of data, and they're really used for high definition video. That's their primary use. But you could also store data on these discs. So a Blu-ray disc, or a BD, stores about 25 gigabytes on a single layer and 50 gigabytes on a double layer. And an example of a use of Blu-ray disc is in the Sony PS3 or the PlayStation 3. It uses Blu-ray discs for all the video games. You can also get movies, high definition movies, on your Blu-ray disc and watch high definition movies on a high definition TV. The other competing standard, there's not really a standard yet for high definition DVD. The other competing standard is HD DVD, and it holds about 15 gigabytes on a single layer and about 30 gigabytes on a double layer. Now, an example of a use for this is the Xbox 360. All of its video games are on high definition DVDs, but you can also get movies on high definition DVDs. And of course, you can also buy Blu-ray or HD DVD drives for your computer, and then the disc that you would use to burn your own HD or Blu-ray high definition discs. Unfortunately, the cost today for high definition and Blu-ray disc is so just exorbitant compared to a DVD drive. DVD drives that can burn DVDs have gotten down to be reasonably priced, as little as, I don't know, say $80 for a burnable, recordable DVD drive, and the media has gotten down under $1 each. Blu-ray and high definition DVD drives, on the other hand, are close to $1,000, and the discs are close to $20 or $25 each. So just a comparison before you go out and start shopping for your next Blu-ray or HD DVD drive for your computer. You might want to wait a little while until the prices come down. All right, now let's talk more about CD DVD drives and discs. Now, CD DVD drives run at different speeds. They may even read at one speed and burn at another speed. For example, you might have a speed rating on a drive of 32x by 16x by 4x. So watch out for these when you go and select your DVD or CD drive. Now, here on the left, we have a DVD. This is the front of the DVD, and this is the back of the DVD. The back here is what you have to be concerned about getting scratched or dirty. You want to protect that back at all costs. The light actually shines up through the bottom and then reflects off the top and then goes back down. So the light comes in the bottom and then is reflected off of this coating here and then goes back down. So that's what a DVD looks like. Here's an external DVD drive on the right, You can see it has a tray, it has an eject button and a status light, and this is a USB drive that will connect to any computer with a USB port and give you an instant DVD drive that's also a recordable CD and DVD drive. All right, here is an internal CD DVD drive. This mounts in your computer permanently. You can see on the back here, just slightly, it has the typical Molex power connector like a hard drive does, and then it has an eIDE interface that connects to your computer. All right, now let's talk about tapes and tape drives. So we talked about non-removable storage that goes inside your computer. That's your hard disk drive. Then we talked about other types of removable storage, such as CD, DVD drives, floppy drives, and USB flash drives. So now let's take a look at another form of removable storage, and that is magnetic tapes or tape drives. So magnetic tapes, or mag tape, sometimes people call it, has long been used to store data. Long before hard drives even existed, there were magnetic tapes. Tapes and tape drives are still heavily used for tape backup because they have the highest capacity of any removable storage. So many home computer users don't use tape backups today because USB hard drives or USB flash or DVDs have gotten to be so inexpensive. But for companies that need to store a lot of data and do their backups, tape drives are still the best choice. For example, an LTO-4 tape drive can hold up to 800 gigabytes of data compressed. Now, when you think of mag tapes, you can also think of old cassette tapes. Those were a form of magnetic tapes. Those magnetic tapes aren't used anymore. But today, LTO tapes are one of the most popular backup tape drive standards for medium and large size businesses. So on the right here, this is a tape drive. This is actually an external tape drive. It has a SCSI connector on the back. We'll be talking about SCSI a little bit more in a minute. But it interfaces with a computer with a SCSI connector, and here on the front, that's where you insert your tape. The two most common standards today for magnetic tapes are DLT and LTO. Here on the right, we have a DLT tape drive, and over here on the left, we have an LTO tape cartridge. Two incompatible standards. Each has its own cartridge and each has its own drive, and they're made by different companies. All right, now let's talk about some forms of other removable media. So we've been talking a lot about removable media. We talked about USB memory sticks as being a form of removable flash media. Now, some other forms of removable flash media that are in different form factors are SD, or secure digital, CF, compact flash, MS, or MS Pro, which is memory stick or memory stick pro, and then SM, smart media. There are other types of devices that can go into SD and CF card slots besides just flash media or storage. So these types of card slots that these little cards go in, some of them can be used for other things. So here on the left, first we have a compact flash. This is the top and the bottom of a compact flash card, and these are used in cameras, in PDAs, laptops, all sorts of things to store files in a removable media format. So CF, or compact flash. The second one is SD, secure digital. This is just another form or another form factor of removable media. Then there's smart media, the SM card. That's what this is right here. It's a much smaller card actually than either one of these two. The picture doesn't show that completely, but it's much smaller and much thinner than either one of these. And then over here on the right, I have an example of a compact flash card. That's what this is. But it's actually an Ethernet card. So it's an Ethernet adapter in the compact flash card slot format. So there's some different things you can do with these different types of media. Commonly, they're used to store data, but sometimes in the case of SD and CF card slots, they can be used to do other things. All right, now let's take a look at system boards. A system board is the main board of the computer. A system board is commonly called a motherboard. So let's take a look now at some motherboards. All right, I have here some photos of motherboards. This is a motherboard I took out of a computer, and you can see it's a circuit board. They come in various sizes. Sometimes they're very small. This one's actually pretty small. Sometimes they can be larger. This is the main board of the computer. So on this board are going to be many of the components that make up the computer. You know, just like inside the human body, you have the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, all those important pieces of the human body. This motherboard has many of those important pieces on it. So here on the left, you have the processor and the processor fan. That's what processes everything on the computer. Here you have the RAM. That's what these cards are right here. That's where you work with your data when it's being used, when it's up in memory. Here you have your disk controller. That's what controls access to your hard drive, to your storage. Here's where you expand the computer with other types of cards. Let's see, over here you have your video adapter that goes to your monitor, your keyboard port, your network port, your mouse port. On here, right there, is your BIOS, which controls what happens when the computer boots up. So there's a lot of important pieces that are on this motherboard. All right, here's a side view of the motherboard. Here you see a keyboard and a mouse port. You have USB ports. You have the parallel port, video adapter, serial port, a couple more USB ports, network port, and sound. Right, here's a top view, a little bit close up. You see different card slots here. You see a little battery. That's the CMOS battery to store the settings when the computer is turned off. A number of other different types of card slots. Here you see the connectors to the hard disk drive and the CD drives. Here you see the power connector that goes to the motherboard. This is a good side view of the, or top view of the RAM cards. This is a zoom in of the hard drive disk controller chip. Here's some jumpers down here. The CMOS battery again is there. This is the BIOS chip. We'll be talking about BIOS in a little bit. There's some different types of card slots here. And again, just a picture with the RAM actually removed of what the RAM slots look like. All right, so you saw some common pictures of motherboards or system boards. So let's take a look at a little bit more generic diagram of what a system board looks like. So here you have this motherboard or system board. You have your main memory, your RAM, that connects into the system board. That's where that's where the computer works with its data when it's in use. Here you have the CPU or the microprocessor. That's what processes every piece of data that goes in and out of the computer. Then here you have your expansion cards. These plug into slots to give you more functionality out of the computer. Maybe you need to connect to a certain type of network, or you need a certain type of storage. You can buy an expansion card that plugs into the card slot of the computer. So again, here we have just another photo of a motherboard. We've already seen this one, so I'm going to move on. So now let's talk a little bit more about system boards. Now in the past, system boards were just circuit boards where many components were connected. This is still generally the case, but as time has gone by, those components have gotten smaller and smaller and have become more and more integrated into the system board. So for example, in the past, all of the following were separate cards that had to be inserted into the motherboard. So you had a video card, you had a network card, serial and parallel port card, you had disk controllers, you had a card for just about everything. All the motherboard did was connect the processor and the RAM to all those different cards. Well, today, all of these devices are generally integrated into a motherboard. So, in general, you have two kinds of system boards. You have non-integrated system boards and integrated system boards. Non-integrated is where many of the components are separate cards. Integrated motherboards are motherboards where the components like the video network, parallel ports, all those things are all built onto the motherboard. And most, if not all, of the motherboards in production today are integrated motherboards in some form or fashion. Because who wants to buy cards that you have to stick into your computer when you can get it all on one board? All right, now let's move on and talk about form factor. I'm going to scroll down our slides here a little bit. and we'll start off with form factor of system boards. Now, the size and the shape of the system boards have changed over time, so these motherboards again have gotten smaller and smaller. And over time, there's been different standards of motherboards. Different manufacturers of the boards and the chip manufacturers come up with these standards. And so the first one is Advanced Technology Standard, or ATX. This is where the processor and the memory are at a right angle to the card slots. Then there's Micro ATX. It's like ATX but smaller, and because of that it has some limitations. Then there's the New Low Profile Extended, or NLX. This is where the expansion cards are placed sideways on a riser. Then there's the Balanced Technology Extended, or BTX. This was introduced in 2003 by Intel and designed to replace ATX. It has better cooling for the newer and hotter CPUs. Now keep in mind that these are only some of the standard system board form factors, and that Dell, Compaq, and IBM all have their own system board designs. So we dub those proprietary motherboards. So say you buy a Dell, you open it up, there's a motherboard inside there. That motherboard was designed by Dell. It may or may not use one of these standards up here, and because of that, it's a proprietary motherboard. So if you needed to replace that motherboard, you're not going to be able to go out and just pick up one off some internet website. You're going to have to go back to Dell and buy a Dell motherboard to go in your Dell computer. And that's what makes it proprietary. Then there's these non-proprietary, or these standard types of motherboards up here. So say I buy a case that holds a BTX motherboard, and that motherboard goes out, and the next year I can just go buy a BTX motherboard from whoever's making a BTX motherboard and put it in my case that takes the BTX motherboard. So keep in mind that your case has to match your motherboard. That's how these standards work. Sometimes there's cases that might hold, a couple different types, but in general that's how it works. The case has to match the motherboard. Alright, so we talked about form factors, and I wanted to show you an example of a case. So here's a case here, and on the back of this case there's screws and there's hold downs for a motherboard. That's where the motherboard would go. So this case would have to match the form factor of your motherboard. You don't want to go out and buy a BTX motherboard and try to put it in some case that's 10 years old. It's not going to fit, it's not going to work. Alright, again, just a little bit more on form factors of cases. Here's a diagram of the case. The motherboard goes along the back. You have the power supply that goes in there. You have optical drives like CD or DVD. You have your hard drive that goes in here. And that's typically what the cases do. The cases can come in many different sizes and form factors. So I can have a little tiny case, maybe that's about the size of a 6x6 square box that just sits on my desk. And that might hold all of my my micro ATX motherboard, and maybe just only a small hard drive. That may be all I need. Other people want to get a huge case to put in server components or multiple disk drives or high-end cooling systems and big graphics cards. So you have to take into account the size of your case with what it is you want to put inside that case. Alright, so now we can talk more about components of system boards. Now all system boards will have some of the following components. They'll have memory slots for RIM or DIMM memory. They'll have processor slots for your CPU, your processor. They'll have external cache memory. This helps speed up the performance. They'll have a certain type of bus architecture and bus slots like PCI slots, AGP slots, PCIe, AMR, or CNR slots. They'll have a certain chipset. That's the chipset, the type of chips that go on the board. They'll have a certain type of BIOS or CMOS or firmware that help the computer boot up and do diagnostics. Then they may or may not have riser cards or daughter boards. So if we go back to this picture of a motherboard, let me go back here and find it. Alright, here's our diagram of a motherboard. A daughter board would be a card that goes up like this, and then instead of having card slots horizontally like this, the card slots are vertical, so they're on the side of that card. So you'd have a card slot like 1, 2, 3. So if I took this and I rotated these cards 90 degrees, that's what the daughter board would do. It would allow me to have my cards going horizontally instead of vertically like this. So that's what a daughter board does, and many of the proprietary computer designs have that. All right, let me scroll back down here to the components that we were just talking about. All right, so most system boards today are integrated, as we said. Now here are some of the common I/O devices you might find in an integrated motherboard. So first off, you're probably going to find sound integrated. You're not going to have a separate card most likely today. You'll have sound built in your motherboard. You'll have video built into your motherboard. Now for some of the gamers out there or the people who do high-end graphics, that video just might not be good enough and they might have to get a separate graphics card, and that's still pretty common today. You'll have USB and FireWire ports built into your motherboard. You'll have serial and parallel ports. You'll have a network interface card like an Ethernet card built in your motherboard. You may or may not have a modem built into your motherboard. And then you'll have some kind of disk controller like an SATA disk controller, most likely because that's the most popular standard today. You'll have a SATA disk controller built into your motherboard. All right, so now let's take a look at our system board diagram and let's try to identify some of these important motherboard components. So I'm going to change over here to our motherboard diagram. So we have this diagram, and now let's try to identify some of these components. Let's start at the top of this list. So there's memory slots and processor sockets. All right, if I go over here, where are the memory slots? Well, right up here there's DIMM memory slots. That's what this is. This is my DIMM memory slot, and my RAM, my DIMM form factor RAM, goes into this slot and it snaps in. The second one was the processor socket. Well, here is my processor fan. Underneath that is a heat sink, and then below that is my processor socket. All right, next we have the bus slots. Let's talk about the different bus slots on this board. If I go back here, the slots we had listed were PCI. These blue slots right here, these are PCI slots. There's PCIe, which are express. These are new versions of PCI slots. Let me show you what those look like. If I go to this graphic, here's a PCIe motherboard. It has these yellow slots, and you can see they come in different sizes. So these PCIe slots come in different sizes. They're much faster. They're the new version of PCI. I would always go with a PCIe motherboard if you can afford to get a brand new motherboard. All right. Next up is AGP, AMR, and CNR. If I go back here to my motherboard diagram, the AGP slot is not found on this motherboard. AGP is for a dedicated graphics card, and an AGP slot is going to be brown. And I do have a picture of one. If I open up this, you see this right here. This is an AGP card slot. These here are PCI. Typically, PCI slots are white, although on the motherboard I had over here, they were blue for some reason. But this is an AGP card slot. All right, and then the next one is CNR and AMR. CNR slots are small. They're used for communications and network. Commonly, these are used by manufacturers to do certain tasks, as is the AMR. AMR is the audio modem riser. So if a manufacturer wants to put an AMR slot on your computer, they can do that. In fact, this little slot right here, you see this little slot, this right on the motherboard says audio. So that's an AMR slot. Commonly, AMR and CNR slots aren't used by the general public because most people prefer just to get a PCI card and do whatever they want to do. It's the manufacturers that tend to use those AMR and CNR card slots. Okay, let's see, what else do we have here? The chipset. The chipset on this motherboard over here says ITE on it. It might be too difficult to see. It's this chip right here. If I can zoom in, this chip right here says ITE. That's my chipset. That's what provides the logic and tells this motherboard how to communicate. And it also sets a number of limitations, like what speed of USB is it going to support over here, what type of PCI slots and how many. So that's the chipset. The BIOS firmware, if I go back over here, the BIOS on this computer is right here. Let me see if I can find another graphic that has a better picture of the BIOS. Here, this chip right here, this is the BIOS on this computer. And then the information from the BIOS is preserved with this battery right here. All right, riser card or daughter board. This motherboard does not have a riser card or daughter board. It does have integrated sound and video. So if I go back, you see right here, here's an integrated VGA adapter, and there's integrated sound ports right over here. Okay, USB and FireWire ports. If I go to this motherboard, it has 4 USB ports right here. It does not have any FireWire ports on this motherboard. Serial and parallel and network interface card. Right here, here's the network interface card. That's an Ethernet jack. Here's the parallel port, and here's the serial port. And then disk controllers. On this motherboard, there are built-in disk controllers. Right over here, it says ATA133. That's the disk controller. And these 2 slots over here, these are what would connect to the hard drives using this integrated disk controller. All right, so we identified these components on our motherboard. All right, now we can move on to our chipset diagram. I'm going to move down just a little bit. All right, so we talked about how the chipset is what provides the logic for the motherboard. Now here's a common system board chipset diagram, and this diagram is going to show how the chipset is used to communicate with the associated integrated peripherals. So if I scroll down, here you have the processor or CPU. That interfaces with the North Bridge. The North Bridge is what manages high-speed peripheral communication. That also talks to the South Bridge, which is what manages communication between the integrated peripherals. So all those new integrated peripherals we talked about are what talks directly to the South Bridge. So we have the integrated network card, the NIC. We have the SATA controller. We have the integrated USB serial and parallel, the PCI expansion bus, and the integrated audio. So all those integrated peripherals talk to the South Bridge. All the little bit more important peripherals or components, I would say, talk to the North Bridge. So there's the AGP graphics controller and the memory controller, and those talk directly to the North Bridge, and the North Bridge talks to the processor or the CPU. So the chipset is what defines this logic and provides this sort of communication on the motherboard. Right now, let's review some of the slots that are on our motherboard. All motherboards have some combination of expansion slots. These slots are used to insert cards that increase the capabilities of the computer. The slots might be very small or they might be very long. Some common cards that you might insert are disk controllers, network interfaces, or modems. So here's some different slots. Some of these we've talked about, some of them we haven't. But let's review the ones that we've already talked about and learn a couple different new ones. The first one is ISA, or Industry Standard Architecture. This is the oldest one of these standards in the list, and it was on computers made before 1997. It's not used today, and it would have one long and one short slot combined together. Then there's AGP card slots. These are accelerated graphics port slots. These are very popular today for video cards. They're usually brown and they're next to the PCI slots, but they're shorter than a PCI slot. And I showed you a picture of an AGP card slot. There's PCI. This is the Peripheral Component Interconnect slot. These are pretty popular today, but they've really been replaced by PCIe slots. PCI slots are about 3 inches long and they're white. Next up, there's PCIe slots, or PCI Express. These are faster than PCI. These slots are yellow, and I showed you a picture of these slots. Now with PCIe 2.0, the speed is upgraded from 2.5 to 5 gigabits, and that replaces PCI Express. Then there's the AMR slot, the audio modem riser. This was Intel's standard, but it's being replaced by the CNR. The CNR is the communications and network riser. All right, now let's talk about memory on our system board. Memory is where your computer stores data when it's in use. Now, commonly, this memory is called RAM, or random access memory. There are many different types of RAM chips, and when power is lost on a RAM chip, all data held on it is lost. Now, RAM can be used for cache on processors, video cards, disk controllers, or other functions. However, the most common use of RAM is for a computer's primary memory. Now, most computers today use one form of RAM called a DIMM, or a dual inline memory module. Now, the connectors from the DIMM slot where it connects are called pins. Now, DIMMs today commonly have 164, 184, or 240 pins. There's also laptop memory called SODIMM, which is a small outline DIMM. Now, system boards can have a varying number of DIMM slots. The more DIMM slots the more DIMMs put into the slots, the higher density of RAM on the DIMMs, the more memory the computer has. Now, a special type of RAM is called cache. Cache is a very fast RAM, and it's used by the CPU. Level 1 cache is built into the CPU, whereas Level 2 cache is outside the CPU on the system board. Now, note that virtual memory, or VRAM, really isn't RAM at all, and you'll learn more about virtual memory later in the video series. So now let's go take a look at these different RAM slots. I have some photographs I want to show you. All right, this first one here, this is a DIMM slot, and you see that there's two DIMMs inside these two slots, and they're both full. So right now this computer is maxed out with whatever amount of RAM is in these two slots. And to upgrade it and get more RAM, you'd have to take out those two chips, or at least one of the chips, and replace it with a chip that has more RAM. So by me having more slots on this computer, I could expand this computer more with smaller chips. Now, the higher density of the RAM, meaning the more RAM that's on a single chip, the more expensive it gets. So really, the more slots you have on your computer, the better off you are, because you can buy less dense RAM that costs less. Now, on the side here, you see these clips. These clips, when you push them out on each side, the RAM chip will pop up. When you push the RAM chip down, those clips will go in. Here's a photograph of a 512 megabyte DDR DIMM. You see here these pins, these gold pins down on the bottom, and notice there's a little slot right there in between the two rows of pins. So there's the front and there's the back. And on these DIMMs are RAM chips. All right, here's the same picture, just a little bit better, a little bit different light. Might be easier to see that little slot that's in there between the two rows of the gold connectors. And that's the end of our photos on RAM. All right, let's move on. And now let's talk about disconnectors on the system board. Now, hard drives and other internal storage devices like CD, DVD drives connect to the system board, assuming you have an integrated storage controller on your system board. Now, these controllers come in different types. The first one we're going to talk about is IDE or eIDE or PATA. Now, the ATA connector used to connect disk drives and CD DVD drives is commonly PATA. And I have some diagrams down here of what it looks like. Here's the end of one of the connectors. You see these little holes. You see a cable here that has two ends on it, a black and a white, and then there's a blue. Now, if you notice, that blue matches this connector over here. So this blue connector with the pins that poke out plug into this female connector over here. So you've got the male blue connector over here connecting to the blue female connector, and then this cable over here goes off to my CD or DVD drives. All right, next up there's SATA, or serial ATA. This is the successor to ATA, and SATA originally ran at 1.5 gigs, Today, SATA can run at 3 gigs. Now there's internal and there's external SATA connectors. And external SATA connectors are called eSATA. Now on this motherboard here you see these blue connectors. These are SATA connectors built onto the motherboard. You see they're much smaller, and they have a cable that looks like this one that would plug in here and they go up to the SATA disk drive. Keep in mind your disk drive has to match your type of disk controller and your disk cables. So all that has to match: the disk controller, the cables, and the disk drive. So over here I have a chip on my integrated motherboard that shows my disk controller. It says ATA133. This isn't an SATA controller, this is just an ATA controller, but just an example of what the chip looks like on the motherboard. Alright, then there's SCSI. SCSI is another type of disk controller, disk cabling, and disk drives. SCSI offers more performance than SATA, but it costs more too. Today, it's used more on servers than any other disk technology. SCSI drives last longer, and many types of SCSI standards are available, both for external and internal. So what I have a picture of here is a SCSI adapter that goes in a card slot on a PC, and it gives you an external SCSI adapter. You see this here, and then let me show you the cable. So this type of cable would connect to that and then go out to an external SCSI drive. On the other hand, you can have an internal SCSI controller, and it would plug on the controller with a cable like this one and then go up and connect to your SCSI disk drives internally inside your computer. Alright, these different disk technologies that we talked about run at different speeds. So there's benefits to using each of these different technologies. The first one listed is SATA 150, runs at 1200 megabits per second. There's SATA 300, runs at 2400 megabits per second. And then there's SATA 600, which is a future standard, not yet out, runs at 6000 megabits per second. There's eSATA, the external version of SATA, runs at 2400 megabits per second. Then there's FireWire. FireWire is another external disk technology that primarily competes with USB, but eSATA is making a run for that business. There's FireWire 400 and 800, which runs at about 400 and 800 megabits per second. FireWire is commonly used on Apple Mac systems and for higher-end video gear to connect to computers. There's USB 2.0, and today that's the pretty common standard for USB. USB is very popular, the most popular external disk and peripheral standard today. 2.0 runs at 480 megabits per second. Then there's Ultra 320 SCSI, which is another external disk technology used to connect SCSI disk drives. 320 runs at 2560 megabits per second. Alright, now let's talk about CPU sockets on your system board. Now the CPU is the central processor of your computer. All data processing goes through the processor. The processor is connected on either a socket or a slot. Now I counted about 28 different types of sockets and slots that might be used on different motherboards. And the processors, keep in mind, also have to match the type of socket or slot. So with so many different types of sockets and slots and processors that match those, it can get quite confusing. Now keep in mind also that Intel and AMD are the two primary manufacturers of PC CPUs in the world today, with Intel being the market leader right now. So here's some pictures of some different types of CPU sockets and slots, and then the CPUs that would fit into those. So up here, this is a socket for a processor, and here is an AMD processor that's been inserted into that processor socket. Notice how you put it in there, and then it has a little arm that clamps down and holds it in. This is a Pentium 3, an Intel Pentium 3 CPU that would go into a CPU slot. This is an AMD CPU that would go into an AMD CPU slot on the motherboard. And then here, this is the backside of that AMD processor that went into that processor socket. All right, now let's talk about BIOS. Now, although you seldom think about it, the BIOS is a very important part of your PC. BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. The BIOS tells the CPU how to communicate with the rest of the computer, what kind of disk drives you have, what the date and time is, and what kind of video adapter you have, among other settings. Now, if you have an HP or a Dell system, for example, they might have their own type of BIOS. If you have a clone, you might have a different type of BIOS, for example, AMI BIOS or Phoenix BIOS. On this motherboard here, there's the BIOS chip. This is a Phoenix BIOS chip that goes into that BIOS socket. You could replace the BIOS or you could upgrade it with a different brand or a newer type of the same BIOS. So I'm going to show you now on a virtual computer what BIOS looks like. So I'm going to start up my virtual computer down here that I can use to demonstrate what a computer looks like. I'm going to boot up this Windows XP Professional, but I'm going to quickly make it so that it goes into the BIOS, because I want to show you what the BIOS looks like. Whoops, I missed it. It happened too fast. I have to press F2 on this computer to go into the BIOS. Alright, this computer has Phoenix BIOS, just like that motherboard did. And this is what it looks like to go in the BIOS. So you only access the BIOS when the computer first boots up. As you can see, the BIOS is where you set the computer's time and date, although you can also set that in the operating system. Here's where it knows that it has a floppy drive or not. Here's where it knows what type of hard drive is in here, the number of sectors and the size of the hard drive. Here's where it knows how much RAM the computer has. Notice it has 512 megabytes of RAM, or it says 523. There's a lot of advanced configuration that can be done. You can set a BIOS password so people can't get in here. You can set power saving features, and primarily what people go in here for is the boot order. So say you wanted to boot off of a CD-ROM drive or a USB drive, you would go into the BIOS to configure that. So this is what the BIOS looks like. It's text-based. It's a chip that's on your computer, and it's used for the most basic setup to boot the operating system, access the hard drive, access the video, keyboard, and mouse. All right, let me close this out. And now we can move on. And let's talk about CMOS. CMOS stands for Complementary Metal Oxide Semiconductor. CMOS is where the BIOS holds its settings. Now, when all power is lost to the computer, the information, in other words, your BIOS settings, are kept in the CMOS with the CMOS battery. If your CMOS battery is dead and your computer's powered off, the computer will boot back up and not know what kind of disk drive it has or what the time and date is. And it will be unable to boot because it doesn't know what kind of disk drive it has. CMOS batteries look like watch batteries, and you can see this is an example of a CMOS battery over here. And typically today they're built onto the motherboard, but they can be changed out if they go bad. Now, one other quick question I want to ask is, what is a jumper or a dip switch? On motherboards and cards for computers, you commonly have jumpers and dip switches. This right here, this is a jumper, and this jumper would actually be soldered onto the motherboard, and this little jumper that goes on top of the pins would be used to complete that circuit. So you would use a jumper or a dip switch to turn something on or off. Tell the computer something using these manual jumpers and dip switches. And like I said, they're commonly found on interface cards or motherboards inside computer systems. Over here is the dip switch. You see these little switches you can flip with a pencil or a pen or a screwdriver or your finger. They're tiny little switches. Many times you have to use a tool to switch the dip switch. All right, now we can talk about connectors on your system board. And I know we talked about a few of these already, but I want to cover them in detail, make sure you fully understand the connectors that might be on your system board. So first off, you must have video you must have keyboard and mouse. Notice on the system board down here, here's the VGA port, 15-pin staggered port, and that's what connects to your monitor. That's your video port. You have to have it. You also have to have keyboard and mouse. On this computer, here's a PS2 keyboard and mouse port over here. Today, many new computers come with USB keyboard and mouse ports. In other words, they don't have keyboard and mouse ports, they just have USB ports. They can be used for keyboard, mouse, external drives, printers, cameras, whatever you want to hook up. So they've done away with these older PS2 mouse ports, keyboard ports, and they only have USB ports. You can get as many as 8 or more USB ports built into a new computer system. Now, more commonly today, you'll also have USB ports, FireWire ports, SATA external ports, microphone, that's one of these audio ports over here is microphone, speaker and headphone port, those are over here in the audio ports, and Ethernet. This computer has an Ethernet port right there. Now, less common today, like I said, would be a PS2 keyboard and mouse. Less common would be a game port for a joystick. This used to be a dedicated port, but now game ports have gone away and people use USB. Less common today, you'll find parallel and serial. Parallel is commonly used for, or used to be used for printers. This is a parallel port right here. It's still important to know what it is because you'll still see it when you go and work on a computer. But brand new computers today have gone the wayside when it comes to parallel and serial ports. This is a serial port down here, and it could be used for a printer or some other form of communication like a serial modem. All right, so those are the connectors that you'll find on your system board. And of course, you can always add PCI expansion cards to get more different types of connectors. All right, now let's talk about the power supply. To power all of your computer's components, your computer has to have a power supply. So here's a diagram that just looks like, it just shows you a basic power supply. You can see it's got vents for heat, it's got a bunch of cables that connect to the inside of the computer, and then on the back side, typically you'll find a fan and a cable where you would connect the power supply to your AC outlet on your wall. All right, here's a photograph of a power supply, and here you see the back side. So here's the fan, and here's the port or the connector for your AC power cable. So this is just a cable plugs in there. The other end goes into your electricity outlet in your house or business. And then here's an on and off switch to turn the computer on and off. Also on the side of the power supply will be a sticker or label that tells you the specifications for the power supply. How powerful is it? How many watts or volts or amps does that power supply have? All right, on the other side of the power supply, you'll find a lot of power connectors, a bunch of different color cables, different types of connectors, and each of these has a different purpose. All right, the job of the power supply is to convert 110 volt or 220 volt AC power into the proper DC voltages for the computer. You should never open a power supply that's connected to AC power, as it can be lethal. Yes, as in kill you by electrocution. So never open a power supply that's connected to AC power. And with the cost of power supplies today being so low, I would recommend never even opening a power supply. If it doesn't work, get rid of it, recycle it, and buy a new one. Now, power supplies are rated in watts or W. The higher the number of watts the power supply has, the more power it can supply to the computer and all those peripherals you want to put in the computer. Now, the power supply offers this power in different types of connectors for different types of devices. First off, there's the AT and ATX connectors. AT has been replaced with ATX because more power was needed by more power-hungry processors and components. The AT connector, or ATX connector, is a single 20-pin connector. With P4 processors, more power was needed, and the ATX 12-volt additional connector was introduced. There's also an ATX 12-volt V2 and an EPS 12-volt that use 24-pin connectors on newer power supplies. So notice how this power supply connector right here is a 20-pin mainboard motherboard connector. So this plugs into your motherboard. to power everything on your motherboard from the power supply. And usually this 12-volt connector over here, actually I'm sorry, over here will plug into the motherboard as well for Pentium 4 and above processors. Newer cases and power supplies might have different types of connectors that connect to your motherboard. Alright, other types of motherboard or power supply connectors that go onto your peripherals would be, first off, is your floppy disk drive power. Floppy disk drives have their own type of power connector, and that power connector is this small power connector here on the right. That's a floppy disk power connector. The next one is the standard disk power connector. This is called a Molex connector, and it's used to power hard drives and CD or DVD drives. That's this connector here on the left. It's a Molex connector. Now if you have SATA drives in this computer, they have their own type of power connector. And it looks like this. It's this black connector right here. And then you would have an adapter that goes to a Molex connector, so you could connect it back to your computer's power supply that has Molex power connectors for hard drives. So you'd go from this one to this one to this one to the hard drive. Then PCIe graphics cards have their own power connectors. That's what this is over here. So a lot of different types of power connectors are available. And with that, we've reached the end of our video covering Introduction to PCs Part 1. In this video, we learned what is a PC, what makes up a PC. We learned about storage devices, system boards, power supplies, disk connectors, CPU sockets, CD/DVD drives, BIOS, CMOS, different types of connectors off of your integrated motherboard, power supplies, and power connectors. We learned a lot of important information about PCs. This has been a great start to learning about everything you need to know covering PCs for our A+ Essentials exam. Thank you very much for watching.